Stop. You haven't subscribed to the channel yet. Subscribe now. We have new stories every day. Now, let's go. I stepped off the bus just before dawn. The orange glow of the streetlights swayed above the misty alley like ghosts steeped in a sleepy haze. In my ears echoed the sounds of evening shootouts, the very ones I had encountered over the past year. Such images can never be erased from memory. They burrow into your mind and refuse to vanish. My shoulders ached with old wounds, and my heart pounded so fiercely it seemed ready to burst out. I believed that these harsh trials would eventually come to an end, and that home would restore the lost peace. My suitcase fell silently onto the sidewalk. Next to it, my battered army bag stuffed with my uniform stood. I turned toward the two-story walls of my childhood home. On the windowsills, ornaments glittered, and in front of the house, a garden gnome figurine loomed, a clumsy souvenir I'd bought before leaving. Once I had seen it as a symbol of future comfort, that the gnome would watch over the yard while I was away. I looked at the front door. The old bronze handle had darkened in spots, and thin scratches had appeared around it. I had always thought these were the result of the clumsy repairs my best friend Tommy had carried out. He insisted he knew how to fix locks. Perhaps he had done the job half-heartedly, but I used to regard his efforts warmly and with a smile. My legs trembled, though the fatigue of the journey didn't seem debilitating. A thought troubled me. Would my wife see me as I once was, or would she find fault? I had often imagined our reunion, how she would throw herself into my arms, burying her nose in my dusty jacket, while I whispered, "Forgive me for the long separation. Her name is Sandra, though I always called her Sunshine. We had married 10 years ago." I pictured her radiant smile and strong embraces. I expected to find the same warm home I had left when I went off to serve. I reached out and touched the doorbell. The thin metallic button trembled slightly. A thought flitted through my mind. Now she'll jump off the sofa and dash to open the door. But the door didn't budge. Minutes passed as I stood on the porch, wrapped in my windbreaker, while the icy wind bit at my neck. "Sandra," I called, pressing my forehead against the wooden surface. Only silence answered. My fingers fumbled in my pocket for my keys. My key wouldn't turn all the way. I huffed and tried to twist it again. Nothing. I muttered, "Apparently, Tommy replaced the lock. Maybe the old one finally broke." I tried several more times, but the mechanism remained stubborn. Finally, I knocked, softly at first, then louder. A creak echoed from deep inside the house. I could hear someone's muffled footsteps. My pulse quickened, and I almost bit my lip in anticipation. The latch clicked, and the door swung open slightly. Standing on the threshold was Tommy. "Oh." He froze, as if he had seen a ghost. His eyes darted around and his hair was a disheveled mess. His gray t-shirt was wrinkled, as though he had just jumped out of bed. My mouth went dry. I gripped my suitcase tighter and rasped in a hoarse whisper, "Sandra, where is she?" Tommy waved his hand dismissively. "She's sleeping. I came to help with some minor repairs in the basement. I thought you'd show up later." Something weighed on my chest, like a concrete slab. I couldn't shake the ominous feeling. Why was he here at such a late hour? And why did he look as if he'd spent the entire night in my house? He coughed and stepped further inside. I walked into the corridor and shut the door behind me, striving to maintain my composure. I glanced around. His windbreaker hung on the coat rack, and on the floor lay a pair of sneakers, while mine, set aside, were covered in dust. I moved on into the living room, where the sofa cushions were pushed aside and a folded blanket lay on the floor. The room was filled with the heavy breathing of the night. On the table sat 2 mugs of lukewarm tea. We both fell silent. I caught his gaze, angular, guilty, yet trying not to reveal too much emotion. I longed to ask what sort of charade was unfolding, but my lips seemed sealed. I set my suitcase against the wall and caught my breath. "May I see Sandra?" I whispered. Tommy stepped aside and nodded. I didn't truly need his permission, yet he seemed to be acting as a gatekeeper. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, past a closed bedroom door, and pushed it open. On the bed, Sandra lay asleep, clutching a pillow like a little girl. Her thin nightgown had slipped slightly off one shoulder, revealing soft skin. In the dim light of the night lamp, her reddish hair glowed like copper, and her eyelashes resembled the tail of a fox. My heart clenched. I had dreamed of this moment for a year. There she was, my wife. So close. I approached, knelt beside the bed, and gently touched her elbow. She startled and her eyes snapped open. "You're back," her hoarse voice rasped. Then a trembling hand closed around my forearm. "I wasn't expecting you. So soon." I leaned in, about to kiss her, but she pulled back and averted her gaze. "Tommy, is he downstairs?" she mumbled. That brief question ignited a firework of suspicion within me. My throat tightened, but I swallowed my angry words. Perhaps she hadn't fully shaken off sleep. "Yes, downstairs," I managed. "Why is he still here?" She brushed aside a stray lock of hair and looked away. "We were discussing the repairs. The basement is damp. There might be a burst pipe. He had to stay. It's late at night. You know how unsafe it is in these neighborhoods." I swallowed hard, trying to smooth over the nervous twitch on my face. A cold tension oozed over me. A year ago, I had asked Tommy to help Sandra with heavy items a few times, but staying all night and hanging around in a t-shirt with my logo were entirely different matters. Sandra kept her eyes downcast as she clutched the pillow. Beads of sweat appeared on my temples even though the house was cool. I stood up, trying to steady my trembling fingers. "Did I wake you?" I mumbled. "I'll come back later. I can take a walk outside." She shook her head and rubbed her temple. "Don't go. Stay. I need to talk, but not now. Let's go downstairs in a few minutes. I need to collect myself." My first reunion with my wife hadn't unfolded as I had envisioned. Where were the words of joy? Where were the embraces? My soul burned from this silent coldness, yet I didn't want to start a fight out of nothing. I murmured "okay" almost inaudibly and left, feeling as if the walls were closing in on me. I returned to the living room. Tommy stood by the window, having pulled aside the curtain. When he heard my footsteps, he turned, trying to force a smile that looked more like a pained grimace. "Welcome back. How are you feeling?" he asked. I said nothing. I heard the second-floor closet creak. Sandra was apparently changing. "Tommy, can you explain why you're here at this hour?" My voice erupted into a low growl, though I tried to speak evenly. Tommy shrugged. "Well, we were really discussing the basement. Water's been seeping in from time to time, and I remembered your request to check if anything had burst. My car broke down, so I couldn't leave on time." There was nothing obviously inconsistent in his explanation, yet the tension between us thickened like a cloud of ink. I felt an inner alertness, as if my instincts had detected something amiss. "Repairs?" In the middle of the night, I asked slowly, squinting. He looked away, seeming to search for words that failed to convince. At that moment, Sandra came down the stairs, dressed in sweatpants and a plain t-shirt with her hair pulled into a ponytail. Her face was pale and shadowed under her eyes, as if she had spent several nights in distress. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the sofa. I sat silently. Tommy sank into the armchair opposite, while she took the other end of the sofa, as though reluctant to be near me. "There's no need for an interrogation," Sandra said, clenching her fists. "Tommy was helping with various things while you were away. It isn't a crime." Her harsh tone struck me like a hammer. I had come home expecting a warm welcome, but instead I received cold detachment. I longed to ask directly, "Sandra, why aren't you happy to see me?" Yet the words stuck in my throat. "Forgive me if this sounds blunt," she continued, resting her elbows on the table. "I know you're tired from the trip. You probably just want to sleep, maybe take a shower, have something to eat. but we speak as if we're strangers. The bitter lump formed in my throat. I leaned in to touch her hand, but she pulled away, as if ashamed of such closeness. Slowly, she raised her eyes. You need to get used to your return. Much has changed here. I have changed myself. Life goes on. Don't be offended. Those words scraped my pride deeper than any insult. I knew that only with time would I uncover the truth. Suspicion churned inside me. I couldn't suppress it. Had someone else come into the house? Had she grown closer to Tommy? After all, he was my best friend, wasn't he? Or perhaps he had already crossed a line. I didn't want to voice such thoughts. It felt degrading, as if I were humiliating myself with baseless suspicions. And yet her distance was louder than any hint. We sat like that for about 10 minutes. Tommy fidgeted with the edge of his t-shirt. Sandra stared out the window, and I studied the faded photograph on the wall, our wedding picture. In it, we beamed with happiness, standing against a blooming garden. I recalled the scent of roses and her hearty laugh that day. You know, Tommy began, straightening up, I suppose it's time for me to go. I think you can handle any problems around the house on your own. If you need anything, just call. He stood, walked into the hallway, and grabbed his jacket. I watched his back. Once, I would have seen him off with a handshake and words of gratitude. Now I felt like throwing his things out the door, releasing a strange fury. But I restrained myself. Sandra approached the door, and without another word, let him out onto the street. Once he was gone, she quietly returned and stood by the staircase as if she were about to go upstairs. I slowly stood up. Can we talk? I asked. Otherwise, I won't sleep a wink tonight. She turned and looked at me with tired eyes. Let's have some tea. I can't sleep either. Silence reigned in the kitchen as I boiled water and placed tea bags into cups. Sandra smoothed the edge of the table, her lashes falling, her gestures betraying anxiety yet showing determination. As if bracing herself, I slid her tea forward and sat opposite her. I could ask why the key doesn't work, I croaked, staring into the steam rising from my cup. We changed the lock. That's what the company installing the security system advised. A new set was needed. And mine. Apparently, they forgot to give it to you. I think Tommy was going to do it, but he didn't get around to it. She spoke evenly, without even a hint of shame. My years of service had taught me to detect insincerity, but I couldn't tell whether she was sincere or lying. I noticed a trace of fear in your eyes when you saw me at the door, as if you weren't expecting me. I said, tilting my head. Sandra swallowed nervously. Honestly, we weren't sure exactly when you'd return. Tommy said you'd be held up by paperwork. I'd already gone to bed, so I was surprised. A heavy silence descended upon us. The sound of the refrigerator was louder than any conversation. I'm glad you're alive and well. I'm glad I can simply sit here across from you. I managed, trying to ease the atmosphere while keeping my eyes on her, as if searching for something dark beneath. She turned away, running her fingers over her forehead as though trying to dispel a headache. Maybe you're right. It might be better for us to sleep. We have time ahead. We need to talk calmly. I didn't object. Overwhelming fatigue and the first hints of disturbing doubts mingled inside me, turning my head into a buzzing beehive. I got up, and she followed. Upstairs, I entered our bedroom. Sandra paused at the door, gazing at the bed where rumpled sheets testified to a troubled sleep. Her lips trembled. I placed my hand on her shoulder, but she clutched her wrist and said, "You can sleep in the guest room, please." A heavy silence fell between us. I decided not to create a scene. Slowly, I turned and made my way to the guest room adjoining the study, a room where we once kept an old computer, books, and assorted trinkets. Now, it seemed, that room was meant for me. I closed the door behind me, and, leaning my forehead against the wall, clenched my teeth. My heart pounded like a war drum. Coming home had turned out to be a grim affair. There was something slippery in the air, a secret insincerity. I vowed to uncover what lay behind that icy silence. I turned back to the bed, sat on its edge, and let my head fall into my hands. The scars on my chest itched, reminding me of their presence. I heard the floorboards creak in the corridor as Sandra passed by and closed the door to our bedroom. Suddenly, Tommy's words echoed in my mind. "If you need anything, just call." Why had he said that with such tension in his voice? Why hadn't he given me a friendly hug? We'd shared our last cigarette during the grueling days in the army. And now, an electric wall separated us. I tugged the cord of the desk lamp and switched off the light. Night fell upon me with grasping claws. Fragments of thoughts whirled in my head, and jealousy began to seep into my consciousness like a toxic cloud. But I decided to wait for dawn. Tomorrow, I'd view the situation from another angle, learn the truth, and try to understand what it would lead to. Dawn brought a dim light into the room. I rose, feeling that the tears of fatigue and anxiety had dried overnight, though my head still felt as heavy as an iron weight. In the living room, Sandra waited with a cup of coffee. On the table sat a plate of toast onto which she had tossed 2 hard-boiled eggs. I sat down. We were both silent, like strangers meeting by chance at a bus stop. Sandra rubbed her nose. "I'm sorry for acting so strangely last night. I won't make excuses. So much has happened without you, and I've grown accustomed to it. It will take time before we are a family again." I nodded, though her words brought no relief. "What's next for us? Have you gone back to work, or will you be staying home?" I asked, trying to switch to a neutral topic. "I'll work from home for a couple of weeks. I have a remote position," she replied, averting her gaze. "It's more convenient that way. I needed to pick up some documents from the military base and sort through bureaucracy, so I left the house for a few hours. I walked into a quiet street where every step revealed neatly trimmed lawns, parked pickup trucks, and mid-sized SUVs. As I strolled, I noticed some neighbors casting wary glances in my direction. Perhaps they knew I had been gone for a long time. I remembered random conversations from a year ago. "Sandra, hang in there. Everything will be fine. Your husband will return." I wondered how they were looking at things now. Paperwork consumed half a day, and closer to noon I returned. I heard no sound of Sandra or any unfamiliar voices inside. I climbed the stairs and reached for the bedroom handle. The door opened slightly. On the bed lay her purse, and beside it, her cell phone flashed missed message notifications. I wasn't one to pry into personal things, so I only noticed that the screen displayed the name Tommy. Blood rushed to my temples. Had he called? I looked around the room. The bed was made, clothes neatly folded on a chair, and on the nightstand lay a bouquet of dried wildflowers. Once I used to give her fresh ones. She loved the smell of June grass. But now everything had withered. I turned and left, swallowing the lump in my throat. Down in the corridor, I heard the front door open. Sandra had returned, carrying heavy grocery bags. I rushed over to help lighten her load. She gave me a cautious look and nodded. We went into the kitchen, unpacked the groceries, carefully avoiding eye contact. "Perhaps you could cook something," she suggested in a neutral tone. I agreed. Cooking always distracted me. I chopped vegetables and put the meat in the oven. The aroma filled the room with warm notes. For a fleeting moment, I wished to believe that the old harmony had returned, but the tension lingered. While I was peeling potatoes, Sandra said, "I need to go see a doctor for a bit. I have some health concerns. I'll be back soon." I looked up. "A doctor? Is it something serious?" She shook her head. "No, don't worry. It's just a routine checkup." Her tone was devoid of emotion. She spoke mechanically, as if eager to leave the kitchen. I lowered my gaze and didn't press further. She disappeared into the corridor, and I heard the door slam. A pulse of anxiety gripped my chest. With every hour that passed, I was increasingly afraid that something unhealthy was brewing between Sandra and Tommy. Perhaps the doctor wasn't just a general practitioner, but, say, a gynecologist. But for now, these were only unspoken suspicions I dared not voice. About 2 hours later, I sat flipping through an old newspaper when the front door jingled once more. I got up and peeked into the corridor. Tommy stood at the doorway with Sandra behind him, clutching a bag to her stomach. She glanced at me briefly, then quickly looked away. I drove Sandra from the clinic. Tommy began, then fell silent, as if unwilling to say more. I looked at my wife, whose cheeks were flushed. Inside, a volcano of indignation raged. Why hadn't she called me to pick her up? Or did she not want my help at all? Sandra, gripping the strap of her bag, mumbled. There was a slight indisposition. Tommy was nearby. He picked me up. I felt an urge to scream and demand answers then and there, but I swallowed my anger and pretended to accept the situation. I heard them go into the living room. I closed my eyes and fought the urge to scream. Then I followed them. They sat on the sofa. Sandra rubbed her forehead with her head bowed, while Tommy held her hand. The scene looked too intimate to be merely friendly. Their fingers interlocked as if for comfort. I paused in the doorway and exhaled loudly. Maybe I should leave. Tommy glanced at me cautiously and guiltily. Stay, Sandra rasped. Sooner or later we'll have to talk. I took a few steps and then stopped about 2 meters away, my breath catching. I don't understand. Sandra, explain what's happening, I demanded. She bit her lip and slowly withdrew her hand from Tommy's grasp, as if ashamed of such intimacy. Lifting her eyes slowly, she said, I'm pregnant. The explosion of that word drowned every sound in the room. I stared at her face, where shame mixed with a suppressed resolve, and whispered, pregnant, a child. Tommy lowered his gaze, his face contorted with pain. Everything became as clear as a sudden flash. When? How? I demanded, hardly recognizing my own voice. Sandra shuddered and clutched her knees. Several months ago. I was told the pregnancy was complicated, that there were risks. I never thought you'd be released so soon. I didn't know how to tell you this, she said. I swayed as if struck in the solar plexus. My head pounded with the words several months ago, while I had been away for a year. And is this Tommy's child? I whispered, my voice breaking. No one answered. The silence confirmed everything. A dreadful anger crushed my chest. I wanted to explode, shatter this house into pieces. I moved toward Tommy, who jumped up and raised his hands as if to hold me back. Sandra gasped and leaped between us. Stop, she cried, her voice breaking. It was a mistake. I don't want either of you to shed blood. A mistake, I nearly roared. A mistake is when a door key breaks. And now. I trembled. Tommy stepped back a pace, looking as pale as a sheet, a bead of sweat trailing down his temple. I'm sorry, he murmured. We never planned it. It all happened gradually. Sandra was troubled by your absence. We supported each other. Then one day, when he trailed off. I didn't let him finish. I shoved him roughly in the shoulder. He staggered, hitting the wall, and Sandra screamed. I clenched my fists, ready to strike again, but her pleading gaze stopped me. She looked at me as if begging, don't. My throat burned with rage. You betrayed me, Tommy. We went through all the horrors of service together, sharing our last memories of home. How could you? He lowered his head without defending himself. Every second fueled my agony. Are you living together? I spat. She shook her head. No, Tommy is just here sometimes, helping. Our affair happened a few times. Then I found out I was pregnant. Things went too far. My legs buckled, and I sat on the edge of a chair, trying to steady myself. Sandra sank to the floor beside me, breathing heavily as she held her stomach. I didn't want to tell you so early, she whispered, almost inaudibly. I thought time would heal things. Maybe the situation would resolve. But then you returned suddenly. I took a shaky breath, trying not to lose control. I was not without feelings, though my soul was scorched by betrayal. I understand, I managed in a broken voice. I need to process everything. She covered her face with her hands, perhaps holding back tears. I swayed on my feet, feeling the world crumble beneath me. "Go to the bedroom," I said in a low tone. "Rest. I need to be alone." Sandra slowly rose and headed for the stairs without another word. I watched her leave, noting how her figure now betrayed a rounded belly, more obvious than yesterday. Perhaps she had managed to conceal it under loose clothing until I saw her up close. My heart tightened with pain, anger, love, and disappointment, all coalescing into one tight knot. She disappeared into the dark corridor, and I remained in the living room, clinging to the edge of a shelf so I wouldn't collapse on my knees. A grim vision played before my eyes. Sandra and Tommy huddled on the same sofa, her whispering words meant for me to him, their embrace breaking all our vows. And that child, their secret, which I learned in the most painful way. I looked up at the ceiling, struggling to lift my chest with heavy breaths. I realized the confrontation had only just begun. Days stretched on like thick molasses. I woke in the guest room, hearing Sandra's morning steps and her quiet phone conversations. Sometimes I suspected she was talking to Tommy. I tormented myself with thoughts, yet lacked the strength to stage another scene. She was pregnant, and I didn't want to push her to a nervous breakdown. And what was I to do with my own fury? We barely spoke. She hid in the bedroom or sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, while I quietly left the house, feigning interest in finding a new job. At the military base, they assured me they would offer me an instructor position, but I had not yet agreed, unsure of how to live on. Sometimes I tried to be friendly, asking if she needed help, bringing her medicines for nausea, buying her fruits. Sandra accepted these with a subdued gratitude, but never smiled. It was as if two enemies had been forced to live under the same roof. We never spoke of Tommy. It was agreed that doing so would only cause more pain. Yet he periodically called Sandra, visited when I wasn't home, or when I left the room. I sensed his presence from the mug left on the table or a new pack of cookies on the counter. My pride was cracking at the seams, yet I couldn't banish it or start a fight. I wasn't the type to strike a pregnant woman, and Tommy kept his distance, avoiding direct confrontation. One day, returning from a walk, I heard their voices in the living room. I cracked open the door and froze, not stepping inside. They sat so close on the sofa, whispering about something. Sandra even smiled faintly as Tommy touched her hand. My mind boiled. I felt as though I were watching someone else's life. I longed to barge in and shatter that idyllic scene, but then I remembered that Sandra was fragile now, worn out by her ailments. My blow to Tommy might lead to irreversible consequences. Instead, I returned to the hall, quietly removed my jacket, and left the house. That day, until late in the evening, I wandered the streets, entered a bar, and ordered a glass of whiskey, feeling sharply how the world had lost its former shape. Some men around chattered about baseball, others shared family stories, while I drank in silence, remembering how I once dreamed of raising a son or daughter with Sandra. A year ago, I had left certain that everything was stable. Now, we were no longer a family. It was them together, my wife and my friend. A week later, the neighbors organized a friendly get-together, and I was invited out of old ties. They had invited Sandra as well, but she declined, citing her health. Only one person showed up. The hostess shielded me from too many probing questions, offered beer and snacks, and I, as I knew how, engaged in small talk about politics and the weather, trying to hide my inner torment. But at one point, a neighbor named George said, "I often see Tommy coming to your house. Is everything all right?" My heart clenched. I forced a crooked smile and lied. "He's helping Sandra. I've got a lot going on. I was in the army, you know." George nodded, though his eyes betrayed unmistakable sympathy or curiosity. Perhaps the whole neighborhood had long been whispering about this scandalous affair. I hurriedly changed the subject. Later, on my way back, I noticed a figure near my house. In the darkness, I made out Tommy's silhouette as he smoked by the gate. I slowed my pace, bracing for a stern conversation. He heard my footsteps, abruptly flicked away his cigarette, and stepped closer. "Hello. What are you doing here?" I grumbled, raising an eyebrow. Before he could reply, Sandra appeared at the gate. In the dim streetlight, she looked like a ghost, her face tired. "We need to talk, all three of us." I stepped into the yard, my heartbeat quickening, the air charged with the tension of an impending storm. "This is too much," I said, my voice breaking. "Do you really think I'm obliged to listen to your explanations?" Sandra clasped her hands to her chest. "Yes, because Tommy and I can't pretend everything is okay. We want to find a solution, a way to move forward." I felt a surge of anger, but stepped onto the porch where a weak lamp glowed. Tommy sighed. "Listen, I understand your fury. It's justified. I caused pain. We both did. But there's a child. Sandra's pregnancy is complicated, and the doctors say she must avoid stress. She's anxious, and I worry for her. Yes, it looks like betrayal. And it is. But what can we do now?" I stared at him gloomily. "Do you want me to disappear?" "No," Sandra interjected. "On the contrary. I don't know what's right for us, but I'm trying to maintain some decency." Decency. I spat the word as if it were a burning coal. "After everything that's happened." Tommy lowered his gaze and nodded. "We're not asking for forgiveness. That would be hypocritical. We just want to at least end this feud, because Sandra might not be able to endure much more." I clenched my fists and looked up at the starry sky, recalling the endless desert where I once patrolled with my comrades, when even the smallest details seemed insignificant because survival was all that mattered. And now I was fighting the pain inflicted by those closest to me. "So you're suggesting we become friends?" I sneered. "I doubt it will work. But I have no desire to drive Sandra to a breakdown." She bit her lip and stepped closer. "I appreciate that. Maybe we can figure out a way to either separate or coexist peacefully. But it's crucial that the baby is delivered under calm conditions." I closed my eyes as a hot tear burned in my corner. Dan, it hurt too much. Yet, looking at her, tired and pale, I couldn't bring myself to hurt her. I stepped off the porch and sighed. "Fine. I won't tear the house apart. But don't expect me to smile." "We understand," agreed Tommy. "I'm even willing to cover part of the doctor's expenses if—" "Don't even mention money," I roared, my heart quivering with rage. "Don't try to buy a clear conscience." Tommy leaned against the wall and sighed. Sandra placed her hand on the door and looked at me. "Maybe you'll come inside." "No, I'll take another walk. I need the air." They froze beneath the trembling light as I stepped outside and slowly walked down the alley, feeling as if a wound in my chest was bleeding endlessly. In the following days, we continued living under the same roof, each of us maintaining a fragile neutrality. Tommy sometimes dropped by, bringing vitamins for Sandra, helping her gather her things, driving her to the doctor, while I avoided seeing them. At night, I lay awake, listening to Sandra shift in our marital bedroom. Occasionally, I heard her soft moans and knew she might be in pain from the pregnancy. One night, unable to stand it any longer, I approached her door and quietly asked, "Do you need help?" She lay on the bed, looking at me with tearful eyes. I came over, handed her a pill and a glass of water. She took them and nodded. "Thank you." No more words were exchanged. Yet that brief moment reminded me that despite everything, I still cared about her suffering, even after her betrayal. A few times she tried to be polite, asking if I was sleeping well or if I was hungry. I answered curtly, holding back my indignation. Sometimes she mentioned that she was scared. Her pregnancy was complicated by a conflict, and the doctors warned her to take it easy. In those moments I wondered if she was seeking my involvement, but had she found even a drop of compassion in my heart? I was too torn inside to give her any tenderness. One day I decided to take out the trash from the yard, air out the garage, do some household chores. a way to distract myself with physical work. I opened the gate and noticed Tommy's old toolbox left there from long ago. My heart tightened with memories. We used to joke as we moved that box, laughing over minor repairs. In a fit of rage, I overturned the toolbox onto the floor. Wrenches and screwdrivers clattered on the concrete. A torrent of emotions overwhelmed me. I kicked an iron bucket. It clanged away. I wanted to scream so loudly that the entire neighborhood would hear, to release my pent-up pain. But the street was silent, with only the breeze causing the trees to sway. I sat beside the scattered tools, burying my head in my hands. I saw no way out of this impotence. Nothing could bring back the life we once had. Yet a few hours later, I remembered Sandra's health. I wanted to withdraw, to hide, but my conscience wouldn't allow me to abandon her. After all, she was carrying a child, even if it wasn't mine. And the risks were high. A knock at the gate distracted me. It was Emily, our neighbor, offering a basket of baked goods. "Here, give this to Sandra." I heard these months have been hard on her. I nodded mechanically. Emily smiled and wished us luck. Neighbors clearly sensed that something was amiss, but delicately refrained from prying. That evening, Sandra and I had a heavy conversation at the kitchen table. She said, "Maybe I should leave. Rent a place. I see how hard it is for you to be near me." I shook my head and ran my fingers through my hair. "It makes no sense. You're pregnant, exhausted, and have a doctor by your side. And I don't want you to shoulder everything alone. No matter our conflict, you shouldn't break yourself." She fell silent for a long moment, then added, "It's unbearable for you to look at me. I know, but I want to have this baby in normal conditions. I mean, don't explain," I interrupted. "I understand what's happening. Let's wait. Let these critical months pass, and then decide what to do next." Sandra gripped the edge of the table and nodded. Fear shone in her eyes while my mind roiled with anger. Yet we reached an unspoken truce, to wait until health permitted. Time passed, and I continued noticing that from time to time Sandra secretly met with Tommy. He would drive her, help her financially, though he never flaunted it before me. One evening, when Sandra left, I sat on the porch and saw Tommy's car pass by. He slowed down briefly, then drove on, avoiding unnecessary conversation. All these episodes were slowly fracturing my nerves. I couldn't drink endlessly, nor did I want to drown my sorrows in alcohol. I tried to hold myself together, to grasp what the outcome would be. One night, lying in the guest bed, I heard a quiet moan, not of physical pain, but something else. I cracked open Sandra's door and crept to her room. Standing near the slightly open door, I suddenly saw her standing at the window. She was crying, softly repeating something like, "Forgive me, forgive me." She clutched her shirt, unbuttoned halfway, and in the moonlight the curve of her figure revealed that she was about 6 months along. I realized that perhaps she longed for a normal marital relationship, or craved the attention and embraces I could no longer give. But in that moment, I felt only bitterness and an irreparable loss. Perhaps she was silently pleading for forgiveness, from me or even from herself. I quietly stepped away, not wanting to intrude on her space. Yet inside, an impulse stirred, urging me to reach out, to tell her that once I loved her more than life itself. That night I barely slept, tormented by the thought that I could no longer live in this chaos. The morning began with a shattering phone call. Sandra couldn't get out of bed. She was trembling, clutching her waist and gasping for air. I rushed to her side and saw her curling up, holding her stomach. "God, what's wrong with you?" I shouted as I reached her. She was drenched in sweat, her face contorted in pain. "Call Tommy," she whispered. My heart clenched, but I swallowed my pride and grabbed the phone. Within seconds, Tommy was on the line. I shouted for him to rush her to the hospital. Within minutes, he arrived at the house. I helped him lift Sandra and lay her in the back seat. She moaned, her teeth chattering. Tommy glanced at me and managed, Please, don't leave us." I didn't think twice. I sat beside her, wrapped my arms around her shoulders, and the car roared off toward the hospital. In the emergency room, the doctors immediately took Sandra into a ward. Tommy and I were left in the corridor. I paced the hall, clenching my fists as I met the stares of the staff. Tommy stood by the wall, head bowed. "I'm sorry that I—" he began, coughing. I turned to him and exploded. "Shut up. Enough of your foolish apologies. Right now, what matters is that she and the baby are safe." He pressed his lips together and nodded. And so we stood, two adversaries, equally trembling with fear for one woman and her unborn child. After half an hour, a thin, bespectacled doctor appeared. He explained that there was a threat of premature labor and that urgent measures were necessary. He said that Sandra needed to rest, that stress must be avoided, and that medication was required. My knees nearly buckled as I imagined a terrible end. Her loss, the baby's death, or serious complications. "We'll do everything we can," the doctor promised before leaving. Sitting on chairs in the corridor, I stared at the faded paint on the wall. Tommy leaned against a windowsill, fiddling with a paper cup from a vending machine. "If anything happens to her, I won't survive," he whispered. I looked him in the eyes. "Neither will I." He bowed his head. A long moment of silence passed, in which we both silently acknowledged how much she meant to us. "Listen," Tommy said quietly, almost in a whisper. "I never intended to ruin your marriage. Sandra was lonely. She thought you wouldn't return. She cried and blamed herself for not being there when you left. I tried to comfort her, and then I got drawn in. Don't give me any more excuses," I snapped. "You can take her away. She chose you." "Don't say that. I never meant to take her from you. But now, it's my responsibility. I'll be by her side." Those words shattered my heart, but I no longer had the strength to argue further. After several hours, Sandra was moved to a private room. We were allowed to visit her in turns. I went in first. I saw her pale face, an IV in her hand, her eyes clouded, but she recognized me. "Listen," she whispered. "Forgive me if you can. I never wanted things to end like this." I sat on a chair, eyes fixed on the monitor showing her pulse. "Don't speak," I replied softly. "Just think of yourself and the baby." She grimaced and touched my fingers. "I know we've passed the point of no return, but I don't want you to die from anger. We were a family for so long. Remember our early years, when we'd sit together playing board games, watching old movies." I looked away, an abyss of memories opening inside me. Her breathing eventually steadied, and the doctors administered sedatives and lowered her blood pressure. I sat beside her, placing my hand on her trembling palm. "The most important thing is that you get better," she sniffled and squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry. I have no right to ask, but I beg you." I said nothing, just stayed there. Then I was asked to leave so that Tommy could visit her. I stepped out into the corridor and leaned my head against the wall. Despair crashed over me in waves. I realized that the only viable option was to wait for the baby to be born safely and then leave, bidding farewell to Sandra forever. The day came when contractions started suddenly. The baby arrived earlier than expected, yet chose that very moment to be born. Tommy and I rushed Sandra to the hospital. She screamed in agony. The ward filled with the smell of antiseptics and the terror of childbirth. Nurses dashed about and doctors barked orders. My heart shattered as I clenched my fists, trying not to interfere. Tommy followed her into the ward, and I was stopped at the door, told that not everyone could enter. I remained in the corridor, listening to her screams. Memories of when we dreamed of children, imagining the day together, flashed before me. But now, another man stood beside her. 2 hours dragged by like an eternity. Then, a faint cry of a baby was heard. I pressed my forehead against the wall, exhaling a heavy sigh. The baby was born. The doctor emerged and said everything had gone relatively normally, though Sandra needed time to stabilize. I paced the corridor, waiting until I was allowed in. My mind swirled with thoughts. This isn't my son, not my daughter, but it is a baby, born of the woman I loved. Did I want to see this child? I wasn't sure, but deep inside something pricked at me, forcing me to curse all that was happening. An hour later, a nurse called me into the room. I entered and saw Sandra lying under a sheet, her face pale, but a faint smile playing on her lips. Tommy sat beside her, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. The baby's cry was barely audible. My heart tightened with sorrow. I was asked to come closer. Sandra raised her eyes. It's a girl. Alive. The doctors say everything's normal given the risk. I fell silent, a lump forming in my throat. I stood like a statue, not knowing what to do with my hands. Tommy gently rose and approached me. Would you like to hold her? I shuddered. I looked at his face, etched with resignation and a pleading look. No, I didn't want to. This was his daughter, not mine. Yet Sandra's pleading gaze touched something within me, as if silently asking for a gesture of humanity. With difficulty, I extended my hands. Tommy gently placed the tiny feather-light bundle into them. The baby's little heart pounded rapidly, its tiny hands trembling. I stared at that delicate face, its pale eyelids so fragile. For a moment, a tenderness for this defenseless creature stirred within me. But then a painful wave reminded me that this girl was the product of betrayal. Taking a few steps, I sat on a chair, fearful of dropping her. My hands trembled, and goosebumps rose on my skin. Sandra leaned forward and whispered, "Thank you for staying with us until this moment." I closed my eyes and patted the baby's head. Then, gently, I returned her to Tommy. I rose, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Tears welled in my eyes, but I forced myself to remain composed. "Now you have a child," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I'm glad she was born alive." Tommy carefully cradled the baby and nodded. "Yes, that's right. We are grateful to you." Sandra watched me with tear-streaked eyes, softly repeating, "Forgive me, forgive me." I raised my hand in a silent plea for silence. I couldn't bear to hear those words any longer. I approached the bed, ran my hand through her hair, recalling our happier days, the smiles, passionate embraces, the youth we once knew. Then a burning lump formed in my throat, and I whispered, "Goodbye." She clutched my hand. "No, we can find a way." "I can't," I interrupted, withdrawing my hand. My gaze drifted over the tiny face of the baby, the rumpled sheet, the faded walls of the room. One last look at Tommy, who said nothing, just held the baby. Then I abruptly turned and left. In the corridor, I stopped, took a deep breath, and my heart pounded as if I were sprinting the final stretch of a marathon. I knew I was leaving the hospital, leaving behind a whole chapter of my life. But I couldn't forgive them. I couldn't bear it. And to remain in a triangular relationship, that was against everything I believed in. I went downstairs, feeling the world around me grow dim. In the waiting area, people searched for doctors or wept quietly. I stepped outside, where a cool wind blew. I removed my army badge from around my neck and clutched it tightly. I recalled all the times I had thought of Sandra from afar, drawing strength from the memory of our love. Now that past had become a fatal wound. I walked to the bus stop, not knowing where I'd go, but deep inside I understood. I needed to leave this neighborhood, this city, start over somewhere else. I had served my country, remained faithful to my marriage, yet was struck down by those closest to me. My heart boiled with pain, but with it grew a determination not to let this betrayal crush me completely. The bus arrived, its doors swung open, and I climbed aboard, dropping coins into the fare box. I glanced at the neon road sign. It led to the city center. Perhaps from there, I'd catch a ride to another state. It no longer mattered. I just had to be far away from that house where everything had fallen apart. I took a seat by the window. The engine roared, the bus set off, and as my eyes closed, I imagined a new chapter of my life unfolding. Without Sandra, without Tommy, with a scar on my soul, but still with hope that somewhere ahead lay a piece of peace. Perhaps I would cherish the memory of the love I once knew, a love now prematurely lost to betrayal. But I would never return to that past. I had to move forward, before the last remnants of my strength were gone. The wheels hummed on the asphalt, the lights inside flickered, and as I watched the city blur past the window, I realized that one chapter of my life had ended. I would never be the same again. Yet at least I was beginning a journey toward my own future. Epilogue. I never wrote to Sandra or Tommy. I received no word from them. Several months later, I happened to meet a mutual acquaintance who said that Sandra and Tommy now live together and are raising a little girl. My heart ached, but it wasn't a fatal blow, for time, though slow, heals wounds. I took a job as an instructor in a small town and occasionally helped teenagers who dream of a military career. I eventually bought a new home. Small, but my own, far from the past. Troubling dreams still visit me sometimes, yet every morning I rise with resolve. Betrayal didn't break me entirely, though it left an unhealed scar on my soul. Now I know that one cannot fully rely on eternal loyalty, and yet life goes on. New acquaintances, fresh paths. One evening, as I looked up at the sky and saw a strong wind scattering heavy clouds and freeing the stars, I thought, even the darkest clouds do not last forever. I let go of the past, opening my heart to change. The end.